Welcome. Thank you very much for coming. I am the executive director of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center. My name is Renee Redman. And again, I'd like to thank you all for coming. And I'd like to thank Hughes, Hubbard, and Reed for donating this space and facilities and the food. Please help yourselves. I'm going to introduce our two panelists shortly. We're very excited to have Shadi Sadr and Payam Akavan here. But before that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the center and about the report that we're releasing today, which is in the center of your tables. IHRDC is a nonpartisan, independent human rights organization that was founded in 2004. We are located in New Haven, and contrary to the press lately, we are not part of Yale University. We never have been part of Yale University, but we are in New Haven. We have the distinction of being one of the 60 organizations that the Iranian Interior Ministry recently condemned as subversive. Our goal is to document human rights violations since the 1979 revolution in Iran. The purpose is so that these events will not be forgotten, and hopefully by shedding light on these events, we can dissuade the regime from continuing with these actions, and also to enable either Iranian courts and bodies, and as well as international bodies, to hold the perpetrators accountable. We seek to encourage a culture of human rights in Iran, regardless of who is in power. We have two basic programs. One is a very large database, which is available on our website. It contains historical documents as well as witness statements in English and in Persian. We've just started to delve into doing video witness statements too, so you're welcome to look at those. They are subtitles in English. And we also have a program where we investigate and analyze various events that have happened throughout the last 30 years, and we publish them in reports. Also in English and in Persian. They are available on our website. The most recent one is in front of you. This report covers the events from the election on June 12th, this last June 12th, and we had to necessarily end on December 31st just for publishing deadlines. As I said, the English version is in front of you. It's available on our website. There is a Persian version of the introduction in the hallway. We will have the Persian version of the entire report available sometime in March. So, although this report is the longest report we've ever produced, we have to view it as a preliminary report. Witnesses are still coming out of Iran. People are fleeing as they become more settled. They're more willing and able to discuss their experiences. And of course, as we all know just from reading any paper, the Iranian regime has continued to suppress any expression of dissent. In other words, this event, so to speak, is certainly not over. During the last month or so, we watched as the regime cracked down on dissent in preparation for the 31st anniversary of the revolution, which took place yesterday. Many people commented, they said, well, we didn't see many demonstrators on the streets in Iran yesterday, and there didn't seem to be a lot going on. Well, we have to remember that over the last month or so, since after Ashura, which was December 27th, the Iranian regime was arresting hundreds, if not thousands, of people. It executed 2 men purportedly in relation to the demonstrations. However, these 2 men had been arrested before the demonstrations, in fact, quite a bit before the demonstrations in June. And they were arrested purportedly because they were connected or part of an obscure royalist society, and their convictions were based on their confessions, which were undoubtedly forced. This is a calculated move by the government. It desensitizes the population because hopefully, in their eyes, the Iranian population as well as the international community will not pay much attention to these people who are not reformist or opposition figures. And of course, the next step in this would be to actually sentence higher priority people to execution. And in fact, one person who was arrested during Ashura has been sentenced to execution for his demonstration activities. The government also suddenly decided to try the 7 Baha'is who had been in jail since 2008. But for those of you who don't know, Baha'i is an outlawed religion in Iran. It's not supposed to exist. These 7 people were arrested in 2008, have been languishing in prison, and in January, actually in February, their trial started. They've had 2 sessions, the last of which was this last Sunday. They are accused of national security charges and, of course, spying for Israel. The government also shut down a lot of electronic communications. We, of course, don't know specifically, but the internet was slowed. Those of us who watched news coming out of Iran noticed that there was the levels were much less yesterday. It was slowed. People did not have access to Google, apparently, or their Gmail. Suddenly today, we're starting to hear from people. So there was definitely communications blackout, which points to another aspect of this crisis, is that journalists are being arrested and fleeing in the hundreds from Iran. And so therefore, we're getting even less information than we were getting before, less reliable information. So I'm not going to repeat what's in our 100-page report. You can read that for yourselves. But I will say that it does present a picture of a regime who feels threatened and therefore has resorted to many actions that it has used in the past. For example, it has been violently suppressing the demonstrations with beatings, arrests, and killings. It's violated people's freedoms of expression and assembly. And of course, it has murdered people. It has arrested and detained not only demonstrators, but people who were not active in the demonstrations, including minority activists, women's rights activists, opposition figures, academics, students, basically anybody the regime believes might be a leader in dissenting against government policies. While in prison, people are regularly tortured, subjected to long terms of solitary confinement, long, excruciating interrogation sessions, rape, sexual violence, and people die. The regime this last summer also held mass show trials, which looked very much like Stalin. Rooms of the first trial had 100 defendants. A document called an indictment was read. It wasn't anything that remotely resembled an indictment either in Iranian or in international or U.S. law. It was basically a political statement. And after that, some defendants were chosen to confess, which many, if history holds true, many, if not all of these confessions were forced and due to the fact that these people had been threatened and or tortured. So none of these methods of suppression are unusual. The regime has been arresting people without warrants, using excessive force, interrogating people, torturing them, and executing them since 1979. I'd like to stress that this is illegal under Iranian as well as international law. The Iranian constitution prohibits the use of torture, prohibits the use of forced confessions, provides for due process rights for people who are arrested, including the right to a lawyer and the right to know the charges against them. So IHRDC, the center, has joined the calls of many organizations to urge and to have the Iranian regime stop arresting political dissenters, and to allow people to express their dissent to government policies, to stop beating, arresting, and killing demonstrators. Also for the immediate release of all political prisoners, especially those who are arrested merely for their expressions and their associations. To stop executing political prisoners, particularly when the executions are based on forced confessions, and to institute a system of investigation, of real investigation, whereby the perpetrators and the people who are responsible for these actions can be brought to justice and be held accountable. It is entirely possible that these actions also constitute crimes against humanity. The center does not, is still looking at this evidence and has not reached any firm conclusions on this. However, if these actions turned out to be widespread, systematic, and pursuant to a policy against the civilian populations, they will constitute crimes against humanity. So that said, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Shadi Sadr, who is a very well-known human rights attorney from Iran. She has successfully defended women who were sentenced to execution in Iran. She's also the founder and chief editor of the Zanan-e-Iran website. The site is the first network designed to distribute information and promote knowledge sharing among feminist activists in Iran. She was also one of a number of feminist activists who began a Laws Without Stoning campaign in 2006. She has won several awards, the most recent of which in 2009 was the Human Rights Prize for L'Equivalenza organization, which she shared with Ladin and Roya Boramand. She also was awarded in 2009 the Dutch Human Rights Defenders Tulip Award. Ms. Sadr, Attorney Sadr, has been arrested twice for her human rights work in Iran. First, in 2005, she was arrested in front of the Revolutionary Court in Tehran, where she and 32 other activists from the feminist movement had assembled in front of the court. She was detained for 2 weeks. The most recent time that she was arrested was in July 2009, July 17, 2009. She was arrested by plainclothes agents while on her way to Friday prayers. She was released 11 days after being detained in Evin prison, which is a notorious prison in Tehran. Our second panelist, Payam Akavan, is a professor of international law at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. He earned his doctorate from Harvard Law and was previously a senior fellow at Yale Law School. He's the author of numerous publications on international law. He was the first United Nations war crimes prosecutor at The Hague, played a key role in the trial of Yugoslav leaders, including President Milosevic. He's also served with the UN in Bosnia, Cambodia, Guatemala, East Timor, and Rwanda, and has been appointed as legal counsel in leading cases before the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the European Court of Human Rights. I should also say that he is a co-founder of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center and is on our board. He will discuss the actions of the Iranian regime under international law, and Ms. Sadr will discuss these violations under Iranian law as well as the weaknesses of the judiciary in Iran. I'd like to start with Ms. Sadr.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Can you see me, Shadi?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, hello everybody, and thank you to be here. 8 months after the people's protest to the declared outcomes of the presidential election, human rights conditions in Iran have deteriorated noticeably. Peaceful gatherings have been brutally suppressed. People have been beaten with batons, tear gassed, injured, or killed and arrested. In prison, they have been put into solitary confinement for long periods and suffered physical and mental torture, rape, and slaughter. In July 2009, Mehdi Karoubi, one of 2 reformist candidates, formed a fact-finding committee to investigate cases involving violation of protesters' rights, particularly rape and murder. The central members of this committee were arrested when the first report was sent to the parliament and the judiciary, and witnesses to the violence were seriously threatened or silenced. 4 months later, Nowruz, the news website belonging to Mosharakat, the most important reformist party in Iran, published a detailed report on the clandestine burial of more than 100 men and women had been killed in street protests or in prisons, along with photos of the graves. Meanwhile, the Iranian military court maintained that only 3 protesters had been killed in Kahrizak, one of the most notorious detention centers in Tehran, due to severe torture. At the same time, the parliament launched an ad hoc fact-finding committee to investigate the complaints of torture and killing of detainees who were arrested in post-election protests. According to the committee, 3 detainees were tortured to death in Kahrizak Detention Center. In a report published on January 10, 2010, The committee recognized Saeed Mortazavi, Tehran's former prosecutor general, as the main person responsible for the death of the three young men. Unfortunately, however, he has neither been summoned to the court nor been officially accused or questioned. Similar events occurred in 2004 when Mortazavi's name came up as one of those who raped and murdered Zahra Kazemi, an Iranian Canadian photojournalist who was killed in Evin prison. This treatment of prosecutors and political dissidents violates Iranian law. However, once again, public opinion protesters and human rights activists have recognized the lack of independence of the judiciary and the lack of justice in the political system in Iran. Thus, I would like to find out why the judicial system cannot offer justice in the cases of violation of human rights, especially in the cases of the rape and sexual abuse in the prisons. Article 164 of the Iranian Constitution notes that a judge cannot be removed from the post he occupies, whether temporary or permanently, except by trial and proof of his guilt, or in consequence of a violation entailing his dismissal. A judge cannot be transferred or redesignated without his consent, except in cases when the interest of society necessitates it, that too with the decision of the head of judiciary branch after consultation with the chief of the Supreme Court and the prosecutor general. Therefore, the head of judiciary can simply transfer a judge with the excuse that it is in the interest of society, which is a very flexible concept and can be interpreted many ways. In addition, judges refuse to address cases of torture in prison, especially rape cases, because of the dominance and influence of security and arbitrary agencies. For instance, on October 2007, Zahra Bani Yaqub, a young doctor in the city of Hamadan, was arrested in a park by Basij militia along with her boyfriend. She was accused of breaking moral rules which do not allow any extramarital relationships. 48 hours later, her body was delivered to her family. The authorities from the Basij detention center announced she had committed suicide in detention, but her family and lawyer Shirin Ebadi called her death suspicious. They filed an official complaint. According to the forensic report, she had two bruises on the left and right thighs, and Bani Yaqub's family and lawyer announced she had also been the subject of rape in prison. 2 months later, the media received an official order that banned them from publishing anything about Zahra's case. Immediately after, the Hamadan judiciary closed the cases. No one had been accused of Zahra's death. The final verdict of the appeals court was also the same. 1 year later, Dr. Zahra Bani Yaqub's family wrote an open letter to the Iranian people describing the details of her case. They state that the judge threatened them into withdrawing their complaint and seek a peaceful way to solve the problem in a meeting which Colonel A.H., his full name was never really revealed, attended. During an interview in 2009, the family attorney said that some documents which proved that the detention center's authorities, especially Colonel A.H., were responsible for Zahra's treatment had been lost. Bani Yaqub's case shows how the lack of democratic mechanisms, including judicial independence, freedom of press, and independent civil society organizations to monitor and control the state machinery, make judicial accountability impossible. Extrajudicial bodies are not independent. For example, according to the Article 90 of the Constitution, whoever was a complaint concerning the work of the Parliament or the executive power or the judicial power can forward his complaint in writing to the Parliament. The Parliament must investigate his complaint and give a satisfactory reply. In cases where the complaint relates to the executive or the judiciary, the Parliament must demand proper investigation in the matter and an adequate explanation from them and announce the results within a reasonable time. In cases where the subject of the complaint is of public interest, the reply must be made public. The Commission created pursuant to this article is called Article 90 Commission. The cases of Zahra Kazemi is one example showing that this extrajudicial institution is not able to bring justice. Zahra Kazemi was a Canadian Iranian photojournalist. She was arrested in 2003 in front of Evin prison while taking photos of a gathering of some families of the student movement activists who were being held in the prison. According to Iranian authorities, she died due to head trauma caused by a fall during a hunger strike. Her family filed a complaint against Evin's authorities and the case was investigated by the Article 90 Commission. After years, the Islamic Republic's judicial system charged only one low-ranking employee of the Ministry of Intelligence. However, Dr. Azam, who worked at Tehran's Baqiyatullah military hospital, testified before the Article 90 Commission that he had observed many signs of beating, rape, and torture on Kazemi's body. His testimony about the rape was not mentioned in the final report, and nobody accused for the rape officially. Therefore, the question of the impunity of perpetrators of human rights violations in Iran's judicial system remains. That's why many human rights activists are resorting to international or transnational justice in cases of grave human rights violations, including rape and sexual torture of political prisoners. Since the statute of the International Criminal Court has not been ratified by Iran, only the UN Security Council can consider referring cases of crime against humanity to an international criminal court. But civil society, especially human rights activists, especially after the 2009 events and after the election, have many ideas and initiatives about fact-finding commissions, courts, and the use of dramatic mechanisms in European and American courts for trial and punishment of those who ordered and perpetrated human rights violations in Iran. Before the summer of 2009, various groups, and especially those in the political opposition, raised the demand for criminal persecution and punishment of those who ordered and perpetrated widespread and systematic human rights violations in Iran. In the first decade following the Islamic Revolution, many members and supporters of opposition groups were imprisoned, tortured, and executed. Those who survived joined writers, intellectuals, and political activists who had survived a similar purge committed by Ministry of Intelligence officers, and together they raised their demands for justice in forms of articles, speeches, political statements, or practical steps. Nevertheless, with the popular protest following the June 2009 election, the necessity of adopting effective mechanisms for criminal persecution seemed more important than ever. When outlining the evolution of human rights discourse in Iran, we see that in the early years following the revolution, human rights activism was limited to those political activists who denounced human rights violations in Iran from exile. After the Iran-Iraq War, when the social space was relatively open, many human rights NGOs were launched, which continued later on when the reformists came to power. Most of their activities were confined to the field of human rights training of civil society activists and did not probe deep into the political structure. More independent groups, which were mostly made up of lawyers, work in a similar framework of denouncing human rights violations and raising awareness. They tried to improve the human rights situation by releasing news concerning crucial cases. At the same time, some activists gradually introduced the need for systematic documentation of human rights violations, especially after the wide release of memoirs by political prisoners from the 1980s, as well as by intellectuals and activists who were suppressed in the 1990s for fighting for ethnic and religious minority rights, women's rights, and workers' rights. Some Iranian human rights organizations then began documenting cases of systematic human rights violations by the Islamic Republic. They published their documentation, which was mostly based on the testimony of victims and their families, along with reports of the massacre of political prisoners in 1988, repression of Baha'is, the political purges of intellectuals, and so on. However, it is remarkable how little documentation has been done, considering the breadth of systematic human rights violations that exist, including the violation of women's rights, particularly rape and sexual torture of women political prisoners, and the violation of the rights of ethnic minorities, particularly Kurds. Although the need still exists to document and prepare legal evidence against those who ordered and perpetrated widespread and systematic violation of human rights, it seems that human rights discourse in Iran is now tending to pursue and punish violators of human rights. In fact, Iranian human rights discourse is now in the transition phase from denouncing violations and raising awareness to a more proactive strategy of documentation and holding violators accountable. Meanwhile, another feature that distinguishes the human rights discourse of the current era, especially after the election, is the strategy of activists to frame the systematic and widespread human rights violation as crimes against humanity, and thus use international legal mechanisms to hold the perpetrators accountable. In fact, many human rights defenders are now trying to verify every instance of crimes against humanity in the 30 years of the Islamic Republic based on existing evidence in order to bring these cases to the international community. They hope that by doing this, they will compel the international community to honor its responsibility to follow through on cases of human rights violations within the country. It seems that the international political landscape has become more sensitive to the human rights issue in Iran, and under backdrop of the Iranian nuclear question has become more receptive to such activities. This has created a unique opportunity for these activists to become visible and be heard. It is for this reason that civil society activists now discuss mechanism ideas such as holding a civil symbolic tribunal based on the Russell Tribunal experience, launching a fact-finding commission, submitting complaints in countries that accept the universal jurisdiction principle, as well as to some United Nations commissions and bodies. In conclusion, human rights activists are in agreement that an urgent need exists for a process of social dialogue and intervention, one in which civil society is able to hold human rights violators accountable and ensure that such crimes against humanity are not repeated. This is a real and strong demand, but But the question which is still remaining is how the idea of justice for Iran should be made real. In my opinion, this is the question for the future of Iran. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shadi. I think that we will now hear from Payam Akaban, and then I'll open up the floor for questions.
Thank you very much for being here today. I want to begin by thanking all those that have made this report possible. Of course, the hardworking staff of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center under the leadership of our Executive Director, Renee Redman. And I also want to recognize gratefully the support of the Canadian government. As a Canadian Iranian, I'm particularly proud that the Canadian government has taken a leadership role in consistently raising the matter of Iran's human rights record before the UN General Assembly. And of course, when one thinks that the first report of the Documentation Center was on the brutal torture and murder of Zahra Kazemi, who also was a Canadian Iranian, one sees the entanglement right from the beginning of Canadian Iranians. I want to also further to what my colleague Shadi Sadr has said, to explain now this question of the future, as she said, of justice. How are we now going to move from the phase of merely condemning human rights violations to creating a culture in which there will be accountability for such violations? And at the end of the day, if